Welcome to the Migrant Resource Centre, Northwest Region Incorporated Diversity and Disability YouTube channel. Your Life, Your Voice program, where self-advocates and professionals in the disability sector are interviewed.
The Diversity and Disability Project would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we work and live and recognise their continued connection to land, water and community. We pay respects to elders past, present and emerging.
Nothing about us without us. We pay respect to all self-advocates who have worked hard over the years and still working tirelessly for their rights, supporting others with disabilities and human rights for all.
This channel is for people with disabilities who aspire to seek self-advocacy role models to inspire change in their everyday lives. Nothing about us without us. Choice and control are central themes. Every interview is as unique as you and I.
And it has our fundamental universal human rights ethos of respect for persons with disabilities, having their views heard and acknowledged. After all, it's all in the name. Your life, your voice.
Be the voice of change in your life.
Good day. I'd like to welcome everyone to another edition of Your Life, Your Voice. I'd like to welcome my co-host, Larissa McFarlane. Hey, Larissa, how are you doing?
Hi, Julie. I'm doing well. And you?
I'm wonderful, thank you. And today we have George Paris, who is I'm not sure of his exact title. I'll let him say his title, but George is from Merri-Bek Council. Welcome, George.
Thank you very much, Julie. Nice to see you, and nice to see you too, Larissa.
Likewise. So, George, would you like to give us your title?
Sure. My title is Disability Planner. I've been here at Merri-Bek for about 4 years, and I work in what's called the Community Development and Social Policy team.
Okay, George, how about we kick off with some questions? Can you tell us a little bit about your role in the council?
Okay, my role as a disability planner is supposed to support council to make sure that our organisation and our municipality as a whole is accessible and inclusive as possible for people with a disability, Julie. And there's a range of different kind of tasks that I do to achieve that. I provide information and advice to council officers quite frequently. I get asked questions on a daily basis about how we can make our services, our information, our municipality more accessible and inclusive. I'll answer questions and complaints from residents as well. Quite often I'll get a resident asking, or even complaining, actually, legitimately complaining about an access issue in their local area that needs to be rectified, where a barrier needs to be removed, and I'll try to advocate on their behalf internally to make sure that happens. I also implement a range of different programs that improves kind of participation and inclusion for people with a disability. And lastly, but not leastly, I also write policies, procedures, guidelines, review council's policies and procedures to make sure that they are inclusive for people with disabilities as well.
George, can we take a step back just to give our audience clarity? So Merri-Bek is the new name for Moreland City Council. Can you tell us just which suburbs or which part of Melbourne Merri-Bek is located?
Sure, that's right, Larissa. We recently changed our name last year after a whole stack of community consultation, and the community kind of overwhelmingly agreed that we change our name to embrace a new Wurundjeri Woiwurrung name. Which is Merri-Bek, which actually means rocky country. The area that Merri-Bek kind of sits in is kind of the suburbs are. Most people will kind of identify with the suburbs. It kind of starts from the south of the municipality, which is Brunswick, Coburg. If we go further north, we've got Pascoe Vale and Coburg North. Then there's areas of Fawkner, Glenroy, Oak Park, and Gowanbray, and this Hadfield. It's about eight suburbs. From most south point would be Brunswick, to the most north would be Glenroy and Fawkner, and everything in between. Yeah.
So can you tell us about the Merri-Bek disability plan? I understand there is a new one, although it may still be in draft. Sure.
No, it was launched last year around International Day of People with Disabilities on the 3rd of December. That's right. We do have a brand new disability access and inclusion plan. It's a 4-year plan. And yeah, it started in 2022 and it finishes, this one will finish in 2026. All councils, but most people will be aware of this, all councils must have a disability action plan. The state government, the Victorian state government, in their Disability Act, their Victorian Disability Act, says that all councils and other kind of local, all councils, I'll just say, must have a disability action plan, and it must do certain things to improve the lives of people with disabilities. So we've got one. We've got a 4-year plan that has 5 key areas, and there's a number of different actions underneath all those key areas. And what I said, ultimately, what our disability access and inclusion plan it provides us with a roadmap on how we eliminate disability discrimination, promote access and inclusion, and reduce barriers for people with disability. So it gives us that kind of more clarity in that process to move through that elimination of discrimination process. I think also an important thing to mention with our DAP, I will refer to as a DAP. A lot of people in the sector refer to our disability action plans as DAPs. That's just an acronym that stands for Disability Action Plan. A key theme in our DAP is this thing called the social model of disability, which I think is important to talk about. Most people are aware of the social model of disability and how powerful it is as an approach to think of disability access and inclusion. And I'll explain what that means. It's different from what's called the medical model of disability. Most people, a lot of times, the medical model, which is a useful model to think of sometimes when we're going to the doctor, when we're at hospital, a lot of doctors would see people with a disability as having perhaps something wrong or a limitation or a condition that needs to be fixed. And that's all well and good when you go to the doctor and you go to a surgeon and they do need to fix you. But in the world that I work in disability policy, trying to promote access and inclusion, that's not really a useful way to think of disability. The better way to think about in my type of work is this thing called the social model of disability. The social model really says that people are disabled not because of the barriers that have been created by society, really, not because of any personal limitation or condition that you might have. So if you think about people being disabled because of some sort of barrier created by society, that then shifts the responsibility back onto society to remove that barrier. Yeah? So it's a really powerful way to think of disability rights. So, and the disabled person can think of themselves as they're not the ones with the problem. The problem lies with society not actually making it accessible for me to access, shifting the responsibility back onto the community, back onto governments, back onto local governments to try to remove those barriers, to give everybody a fair go and to reverse that inequality. So it really provides you, I think the social model of disability provides you with as I said, like a powerful tool to frame a lot of that, your arguments, a lot of your advocacy in a really positive way that shifts the responsibility. It's empowering for people with a disability, I reckon. So that's a really important part of our disability access and inclusion plan, the social model of disability. Our DAP also talks about other important aspects as well. I'm not sure if we're going to have time about that today, Larissa, but we talk about intersectionality, which is another important theme to think about, really. when we're thinking about people with disability, we don't want to just think about people with disabilities as just that, as just people with disabilities. We want to think of people with disabilities like a whole person with a lot of different complex, sophisticated parts to themselves. And they might even be part of other disadvantaged and marginalised cohorts. They might be an Aboriginal person with a disability, a woman with a disability, a trans person with a disability, for example. And if so, that brings more complexity as well into that person's life. And sometimes there might be double, triple disadvantage as well. So we like to think of people with disability intersectionally. Yeah. So not just as just a one person with a disability, one size fits all approach. And I want to also mention First Nations people. I think this is important too. And our DAP does refer to, makes a special mention to First Nations people. We do want to make a special mention to First Nations people because of the, I suppose, the generations of inequity that's impacted Indigenous people in this country. Aboriginal people have kind of twice the amount of disability in their community than the non-Aboriginal people. So we talk about, a lot of inequality that people with disability experience, but that is amplified almost twice as much for First Nations people, and that is grossly unfair and unacceptable. And we recognise that inequality, and we want to do something about that. So I think it's would be remiss of me if I didn't mention that aspect of our DAP as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for also including and pointing to First Nations people and that multiple disadvantage that comes not just through the forces of ableism, but also the forces of the ongoing colonial project and dispossession and the increased rates of incarceration and all those sort of oppressive forces that really impact Indigenous people in Australia. And that was really great. Thank you for that description. And I just personally want to say it's so refreshing to hear someone else talk about the social model with so much passion. As a disabled person, the social model is very important to me because unlike the medical model, it doesn't center me as the person with the problem. It transfers the problem to society and attitudes and the environment. So yeah, I really, really appreciate that. And I also want to say to our audience, well, for me personally, I don't actually I'm not very good at reading DAPs, disability action plans. I don't seek them out. I find them generally pretty boring and don't make much sense, but I did actually seek yours out and read it. And I was really surprised by the fact that it is really interesting and easy to read. So I recommend that if you want to have a look at a good DAP, then look up the one at Merri-Bek Council. Its language is quite plain and it talks about the social model and talks about how we identify as disabled people or as people with disability. Includes a lot of really useful information for disabled people that isn't just like really heavy policy stuff that doesn't mean anything to the average person. And interestingly, I did actually go and look up some disability action plans on some other council websites that I'm also involved with, and they either didn't have one that I could find or they had one that was very poor. So you are leading.
Oh, thank you, Larissa. That means so much to us. Thank you so much. That's so heartfelt. We also provided our action plan, our DAP, in multiple accessible formats as well. We went further this time as well. We've got an audio description, an Auslan interpretation version. We've got large print. We've got easy read versions, PDF Word versions. So we've tried to go as far as we possibly can. And if someone requested in Braille, we will provide that as well. So thank you for that real positive, those positive vibes. It's wonderful to hear. Thank you.
Julie, would you like to ask the next question?
Well, the next question, I believe, has to do with committees. And basically, are there committees that involve the DAC? And, are there any disabled people on these committees?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. We've got what we call a disability reference group. Other councils will call them DACs, yeah, or disability working groups, disability advisory committees. Ours is called the Merri-Bek Disability Reference Group. It's made up of, at the moment, there are 7 residents with disabilities. We have 1 carer on that group as well. So it's open to people with disabilities and carers who who are living, working, or have an interest in Merri-Bek City Council. So we've got 3 vacancies at the moment. 3 people have left recently, so that means we've got 3 vacancies, so a maximum of 10 people on our disability reference group. And you're right, a lot of the work that the reference group does is to help us implement our disability access and inclusion plan. They certainly informed our DAP. They were consulted with rigorously on what that DAP should look like, what should be included in our DAP, and what the action plan should look like as well. And now the implementation of our DAP, they're involved in that whole process. We meet now. We meet quarterly. We've shifted to online meetings because since COVID, actually before COVID, the disability reference group will be meeting in person, but we've kind of been meeting online. We've got our next meeting actually in a few weeks' time, and that'll be our very first hybrid meeting where we'll have we've rented out. We haven't rented it out. We've booked a room at the Brunswick Library. So half of the reference group members will be there, and the other half will be online. We'll try our first hybrid meeting, really. Yeah, but really admire and respect our reference group members. They're deeply passionate, knowledgeable, got loads of lived experience and professional experience as well. We've got a range of people with different disabilities on that group as well. And from different age group, different ethnic backgrounds. So we try to, it's wonderful that we've got that, again, that intersectionality that comes through with our disability reference group that can inform the work that we do. A lot of times as well, we'll get staff, internal staff would come to those meetings, our disability reference group meetings, to test an idea, to run a policy, a procedure by the reference group. For example, our next meeting, we've got our communications team who are doing some work to make our communications more accessible, and they want to get the input from our disability reference group members to see what they think and to see how it can be improved. So very much a important aspect to the work that we do, and I work very closely with our disability reference group members, and in communication quite often, whether it's email or phone call in between meetings. So we've got very, very kind of good open communication with them.
Just a follow-up question, George. So before the policy is implemented on the wider scale, is a reference group involved in testing out a prototype?
Absolutely. As I just mentioned, like our communications team are coming along to the next meeting. They're looking at developing what's called a toolkit, for example. They're doing this toolkit that's going to help staff to improve their communication. So council staff can make their communications more accessible, whether it's in the written form or through videos, whatever that communication looks like in the development of flyers, newsletters, for example, all that external facing communication, we want that to be more accessible. So our comms team are doing a toolkit to help staff to make that happen. So we're bringing that toolkit along to our next meeting, disability reference group meeting, so they can give us their opinion on what that looks like. We've also got we've got an open space, what's called the Merri-Bek open space strategy that's going to be reviewed soon. That's a strategy that's looking at all of our open space, our gardens, our parks, our open space, our playgrounds. So we're developing a new strategy around that, and we want to make sure, part of my job is to make sure that big strategy, that open space strategy includes accessibility and inclusion as part of that. That has to be an important feature of that open space strategy. So we're bringing those staff members to our disability reference group and say, come along and talk to our reference group members so you can hear their input, and they can give you their advice about what should be included in our open space strategy. So it happens quite often. In fact, I mean, I have to also, when we're developing the agenda for our meeting for our disability reference group, quite often I have to let council staff know that they can't attend this one because the agenda's too full and they need to attend the next meeting because we've already got so many staff wanting to come along to test those ideas, test those policies with the reference group members.
Sorry, lost my train of thought. You mentioned, it sounds like a great committee. I have sat on the DAC on another council, and I do recommend for our listeners, if they haven't done that before, it's worth doing. I think some work better than others. You said you've got vacancy at the moment. How can people apply if they were interested to join?
They can contact me, Larissa. The best way to do that is to contact myself, and I can talk to the person or engage with that person. However they, what's the most accessible way for me to engage with that person, I can do that. And Larissa, you're absolutely right. There's so many wonderful. It's not just about for us as a council what value the disability reference group members bring to council. We see a lot of capacity building that happens from the members' perspective as well. I've got so many great examples of some wonderful outcomes for people who have participated, who have been members of our former disability reference group members. They've gone on to serve in other committees, bigger and better than Merri-Bek City Council, gone on to employment opportunities, development in confidence, communication, just also getting an understanding about how council works as well, how meetings are run. Really wonderful for capacity building for a person's development. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I agree. One of the difficulties I found on the council DAC that I sat on, which is quite a few years ago now, was that there was actually felt like there was more disability providers on that committee than there were disabled people, which one sort of silenced us a little bit and didn't give us as much voice because these providers were very vocal and prepared. But also it did create a bit of conflict for us disabled people, because it wasn't a paid committee, and yet most of the people who attended this committee were paid as part of their job. But the only people that weren't being paid were the disabled people. How do you manage that conflict, or is that a conflict in your committee?
Yeah, great questions around remuneration and reward and recognition. We do struggle with that. And before I get into that, I want to mention, just go back a bit about, you mentioned service providers. We've separated the two. We don't have service providers part of our reference group. We've got a separate disability service provider network made up of over 70 local disability service providers, where we get together as well with service providers every I think that's quarterly as well. I convene that too. I should know that is quarterly. So we keep those separate. I am aware, Larissa, that some councils do have the service provider together with their DACs or their disability reference groups, and that may have some benefits, or could have its disadvantages as well. And I can see we decided not to do that. We've decided to keep the two separate. On the question of reward and recognition, I think it's a really important one to mention when we're talking about disability reference groups or DACs. You're absolutely right. Our disability reference group is not paid. All right, much to my dismay, to be honest with you. I wish it was, and that's because all of our reference group, council has a number of different, not just a disability reference group. We've got LGBTI reference group, First Nations advisory committee, human rights advisory committees. We've got about 8 or 9 different advisory committee / reference group, and our governance team came up with a decision that it's purely volunteer based, with the exception of the First Nations Advisory Committee. That's the only one that is paid, actually. So that's the decision we have taken. When the group do participate in a bit of work that might be outside of the ordinary work of a disability reference group member, if I've asked them to do some additional work that might not be in the terms of reference, we do pay them. We do pay them that amount as well. For example, I'm working on a little project now, and I've asked, I need 4 people from the reference group to come forward to help us with the project, and we're paying them a fee, a respectable fee for their contribution for that. But yeah, not for their ordinary kind of contribution to the reference group, unfortunately.
Yeah, I get that it's a difficult point, and I understand why you don't, because of the nature of so many different types of committees. But it is an ongoing issue because, disabled people so often get asked to provide their expertise for free. And it is expertise. I mean, we live this life and we've put many years' work into being self-advocates and working. A lot of us work as self-advocates, but mostly unpaid. Yeah. Well said.
Well said.
Can I ask, because I've never been on a JACS committee, can I ask, I know it's quarterly, I think you said, is it like, how many hours? Is it 2 hours, 3 hours?
Yeah, it's 2 hours every 3 months, Julie. It's usually on a Tuesday from 10 o'clock in the morning to 2 o'clock. From 10 o'clock in the morning to 12 o'clock in the afternoon, with a small break. It used to be a 3-hour meeting, but we just felt that was too long. People were getting tired in that third hour. Now it's 2 hours. I must say, we pack a lot in, and it does feel rushed sometimes because, there's a lot in there. If there's council staff that come along, or if there's a guest speaker, if we're providing council updates as well, and it generates a lot of conversation. Yeah, and then people also, at the end, we have time for information sharing, where people bring in their bits and pieces from the last couple of months that they want to share, whether it's we've got people who are interested in housing, people that are interested in physical access, a range of different issues, and people sit on different boards and committees and work in different spaces. Some don't work, so they bring their own input and want to share their experiences, whether it might be NDIS as well, which is an ongoing issue. So the conversations are rich, are deep, and I find sometimes 2 hours we struggle to keep it to contain the discussion within the 2 hours. Sometimes I wish we had more than that, but we found if it goes more than that, it impacts on people's energy levels. So we think it's that 2 hours is a right time frame. As I said, there's opportunities in between 3 months. Constantly got that communication flowing. I'm sending emails, sharing newsletters, any updates. I'm asking for any requests. There's always that email communication as well that's happening.
So if someone has who lives in Merri-Bek has an issue around access, or they see some disability discrimination happening, how do they best address that? By contacting council, do they contact you, or do they? How does that work?
That's a good question, Larissa. What they should do first is contact council, and through our customer service centre, or numbers, our contact points, and then our customer service staff will direct the person or the query to the appropriate channel. A lot of the times it won't come to me directly, nor should it, because I want those complaints to go to the relevant areas of council. For example, if it's a complaint, let's say around libraries, it should go to the library manager. First, we'll go to the customer service staff member will take that query or complaint and then talk to that person, and if they can't resolve it there, they'll refer that person on to speak to someone in libraries if it's a libraries issue, and then that person can work it out with our library staff. If that issue is not being resolved, if to the satisfaction of the resident or the manager, then they'll bring me in and say, George, can we bring you in to see what can be done to be able to resolve the issue? Sometimes I'll elevate that complaint and say, no, I think our response hasn't been fair or hasn't been adequate. Let's look at it from this perspective. Excuse me. So I only want to get involved when that complaint can't be resolved at the initial level, Larissa. So what that does is, we did that deliberately because we want our staff to be empowered to be able to respond to disability issues. We take a whole of council approach, and what that means is that it's disability rights, disability access and inclusion is everybody's responsibility in council. It's not just George's responsibility. The Disability Discrimination Act, we all fall underneath the Disability Discrimination Act if you work at council. Not just my work, as I said, it's everybody that works for council signs up to provide equitable access for people with disabilities. So it's everyone's responsibility. And look, if that library staff member doesn't know how to do it or just needs a bit more advice or guidance, absolutely, they contact me. And as I said, I spend a lot of my time through my working week responding to queries, coming up with ideas, advice about how it can be more accessible, more inclusive. Constantly, libraries, actually, I would plug in for libraries. What we are launching next week, which is World Autism Awareness Day, we've got our sensory friendly hour launching at our Brunswick Library on the 2nd of April. So we'll be there launching that. So I was helping them out with the development of our sensory friendly hour, what that should look like, with reduced lighting, thinking about noise, thinking about, the setup of the room and so on and so forth. So I'll get in there, I'll talk to libraries when I have to, when I only need to get involved and try to give that additional bit of information. But usually if a person has a complaint or a query, we ask them to go directly to our customer service touch points and resolve it there, and I'll get involved if that can't be resolved at that point.
Yeah, glad I asked that question, actually. That's really a really great response to hear. And I actually want to know more about the sensory friendly hour. Is that going to be a regular thing? And
it is a regular thing. That's exactly right. We trialled it. Sorry.
I was going to say, I just hope it's not at like 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, because that's when they always put these sensory friendly disability hour things like shopping. You have to do it like first thing in the morning. Like, lots of disabled people don't get out of bed that early.
Spot on, Larissa. Spot on. And there is issues around sensory friendly hours. I'm not going to pretend that there isn't. And you're right. You need to think about, and even 1 or 2 hours is not enough, because what that does is it puts pressure on families to say, oh, I need to get to that place at this particular time because it's the only friendly hour. Every other hour is unfriendly, therefore. So yes, you're right. First, let me say, we trialled it for International Day last year, and it was successful. And then we said to library, and we had a conversation with libraries, this needs to be more regular and routine. So that's what we're doing now. It's every Tuesday from 10 to 12, 2 hours. We're having sensory friendly hours. But for me, I want to see it embedded even more deeply and have a lot more than just 1 or 2 hours a week. I'd love to see days or big chunks of the day that are sensory friendly. Because as I said, it alleviates that level of stress. A parent or a person wants to come along to a sensory friendly hour, it puts a lot of pressure on them to come at a real narrow window of opportunity. But look, it's at least we're doing it, and it also sends a message to the community that, hey, there are neurodiverse people in our community, and we need to, there's the social model of disability again, we need to adjust our physical environment to make it more suitable to more people in our community. That's what sensory friendly is about. It's providing that opportunity for neurodiverse people to be able to access our libraries. Yeah,
and I think it's also important to reiterate too that that when you make a space more accessible to disabled people, neurodiverse, or whatever it is, it doesn't take away access from anyone else. It actually improves access for lots of other people. You know, the example is the curb cuts, you know, on the footpaths. I mean, yes, that's good for wheelchairs, but it's good for lots of other people as well. Bicycle riders, not that they should be on the footpath, but, you know, prams, people who use sticks and can't, you know, there's lots of things. Yeah.
There are so many benefits for the whole community. That's exactly right. It's not just for a small section of the community who will benefit from this. That's right. It's beneficial for the whole of community, and it's also said, and it also, for me, it's symbolic, which is powerful as well. I think symbolism is powerful too, because it sends a message that we are trying to be accessible as we possibly can to the community, and we're still improving. We may not get it right. 1 or 2 hours a week may not be enough, but it's a platform that we can build on. I mean, my work in this space, we've still got a long way to go, haven't we, Larissa? It's incremental changes and improvements along the way.
So that brings me back to the plan, to the disability action plan, which is called the Disability Access and Inclusion Plan. Is that right?
Yep.
And so, yes, you talked about how it's a roadmap to eliminate discrimination. And I wondered how long you think that's going to take, and how do you measure the success of the plan?
It's got its crystal ball. How do we, when are we going to eliminate disability discrimination in this country? I don't know. I don't want to answer that question because it's going to take a long time. We've got a long way to go. But I can sit here and talk about our successes so far, but you're absolutely right. People with disability are still being marginalised, discriminated, and there's still an awful lot of work to do. For example, even at that physical level, 80-90% of shops on Sydney Road, Brunswick and Moreland are inaccessible for wheelchair users. There's a step entry in 80 to 90% of shops. That's not to mention inside the shop or the attitudinal barriers that may exist with staff there. There's a monumental amount of work that needs to be done. So but if we ask people with disability about where we are today compared to 30, 40, 50 years ago, a lot of people with disability say we are in a much, much better space. So we stand on the shoulders of all those disability advocates that have come before us. A lot of them are my old mentors, my friends, and some of them are gone now too. A lot of them are. But they really set the scene for us to where we are today, to the achievements that have been made. One of the most powerful achievements is the NDIS. I will mention that. And there's still problems with the NDIS, yes, but it's still, I would stand by this and say it's one of the biggest and best social reforms that's happened in this country ever. People say since Medicare. Yeah, Medicare and the NDIS are probably the two most powerful social reforms. People, I'm not saying everybody's satisfied with the NDIS, and I know the problems that there are, but we have to fight for the NDIS. We have to fight for a better NDIS. We can't rest on our laurels and we can't be complacent about that, because there is still a movement. We've seen recently certain members of our political structures that want to put the NDIS under microscope and even start to cut away some of the gains and the benefits from the NDIS. We need to fight for the NDIS. And there's been the fact we've got also the Disability Discrimination Act. We've got the Victorian Discrimination Act. We've got the Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities from the United Nations. There's all this stack of work that's been done in the last 50 years that has led us to where we are today, which is better position and more equity for people with a disability. Still a long way to go, but we can't forget the great work that's been done by a lot of the people that have come before us and are still here today. And Larissa, I suspect you and Julie are some of those people. And you had a second question as well. I think, Larissa, attached to our DAP about measuring success. How do we kind of evaluate and measure success? That's a good question too. So our DAP has a separate implementation plan which kind of has responsibilities and timeframes attached to it. It's got some responsibilities are council officers or council teams that say you must do this by this certain time frame, and it's my job to hold them accountable. A disability planner does that. I do that. I check in with those staff and say, hey, you signed up to this. What are you doing? What have you done? How have you gone to achieve this particular action? If it's it's an action around open space, around playgrounds, let's say, there's been a commitment around playgrounds and accessibility. I'll go to the open space team and say, how have we gone with the delivery of this? Have you met that? Have you met that action? If not, what stopped you? What could we have done differently to make sure that? So it's partly my job to ensure that our council officers do what they say they're going to do. I kind of hold them accountable. So it's partly my job to review that, to hold them to that account. And that's what that's the good thing about having a separate implementation plan. It makes sure that we are accountable. I must say that is probably the biggest weakness of DAPS, really, what you're talking about here. And I'm glad you've kind of raised it, because it really is the weakest link. And you're only as strong as your weakest link, because if you're not holding yourself accountable to those actions won't get done, or you won't evaluate, you won't know why they get done, you can't demonstrate what you've achieved, you don't know where you failed. So I think that accountability and an evaluation is critical.
It's critical, I mean, for your constituents, I think that's the right word, or people who live in Merri-Bek and nearby, to have faith in you, in your job and in council, if that they're this, because often these plans are made, these DAPs are made, and then it's just words and it doesn't really feel like anything's happening, as someone on the ground who's not directly connected to council. So making that sort of evaluation visible is really important to give faith to people that they can get behind it and support it.
Yeah. Transparency, absolutely. Larissa, something else that we've done differently this time around is thinking about it internally and strategically. And what I mean by that, sorry to use those words, is linking our DAP to risk management, because a lot of time organisations understand. They think things more important when the word risk is attached to. Whenever there's risk involved, seems to elevate the priority. So what we've done is identify the DAP as and actions that we don't achieve as a risk, a potential risk for our organisation. If we don't meet our objectives, it exposes us, in other words, to risk. And the risk is a breach underneath the Disability Discrimination Act, or reputational risk, or risk that we're going to, treat our residents unfairly, and we're going to get more complaints. So attaching your DAP, linking your DAP to a internal risk register, getting your risk people involved in your DAP, linking your DAP to risk, I think is a useful way to elevate the profile and to ensure that we're held accountable. I think so. We're trialing that for the very first time. I'm having conversations with we've got like a risk area, a risk department. There's a lovely cat. And now we've done that deliberately to try to, as I said, elevate the importance of the DAP, to keep it accountable, and to make sure that we say what we say we're going to do. Being distracted by your glorious cat there.
I am being distracted. I'm sorry if you are.
All right. My dog was barking before. I hope that didn't come through on the microphone. Apologies if it did.
Couldn't hear it.
Okay.
I'll pass to Julie for the next one whilst I get my cat on the prop.
The cat often makes appearances on this show. It's a regular feature. Always makes me smile. So I've got a comment about things we talk about. So and I know that change is slow, and we're just talking about it at our steering committee recently, and I've talked about it quite often over the past few years. I'd like to see changes in the wording. So instead of having DAX, have a universal type of strategies, because we all are prone to disability or aging within our lifetime. So I'd like to see, from birth to grave type of strategies. And that way the whole population is involved, and it's not so much a section, a minority group. So if we have a bit of a change in that language, and I know it takes time to filter through to institutions like councils and governments, but I think it'll be really beneficial for the whole society.
So I might respond to that if I may, Julie. It's a really insightful point. I do like it. And we are using more language around that term universe, and we're seeing it prop up more and more now. I'm glad to say that's happening. And particularly with universal design, people, I'm not sure how many, well, this whole concept around universal design principles and universal design is gaining more popularity. And it's exactly that, thinking about the way we design everything that we do that we design. For example, if it's open space, or if it's designing our information, our programs, designing our services or our infrastructure, we should do that thinking about everybody, not just necessarily about people with a disability, but we think if we design for everybody, if we design it, in other words, universally, it makes a lot more sense. It actually makes a lot more sense, not just because more people will be able to access it, but it also makes more sense from a financial perspective as well. Because then if you want to design, if you want to retrofit something later on to make it accessible, it costs monumentally a lot more than doing it right from the start. Universal design has 7 principles on how we should design things, all right? And we might even provide a link to people if I think on universal design. There is the Australian Universal Design Institute, and there are you can find a lot of information about universal design 7 principles, but it really is a useful way to think about how we design everything we do in the future to make it more accessible for everybody. But look, in saying that too, Julia, I'm not suggesting that we remove the word disability or disabled, because, and I know some people think differently about the word disabled and disability, and some people don't like it, but most people, I think, in the disability community, people who are disabled don't mind it. In fact, there are certain movements with the word disabled. People are reclaiming that word. You've heard this as well. Where in the UK, a lot of this came from the UK firstly, where the word disabled has been reclaimed because it goes back to the social model of disability. You know, I've been disabled because of you. I've been disabled because of the barriers that society has implemented. So I'm gonna own that, and I'm gonna use that word as a point of reference and a point of empowerment. So don't necessarily, I don't shy away from using the word disability or using the word disabled. Some of my staff ask me a lot of times, can we use the word disability or disabled? I encourage people to use the word disability. We've got the Disability Discrimination Act after all. We've got the Disability Act. The word disability is not a dirty word, not a politically incorrect word. Sometimes people think the word disability is politically incorrect, but it's not. There is language that we can use sometimes when we're referring to people with disability can be absolutely grotesque and inappropriate, and we know what those terms are, and we try not to use those words. And I don't shame people for using those words sometimes mistakenly or inappropriately, but it's important for us to point out that that language can be harmful and disrespectful. But I don't humiliate my staff when they do use inappropriate language. But I think the term universal is good. The Victorian government is certainly looking at, and also Australia's disability strategy does also reference the importance of universal design. So that whole language about universal design, the term universal is coming more and more into the fore, and we should be looking at universal design principles in everything we do. I'm encouraging my staff all the time to think about the way we do things with a universal design hat on. Well, a couple of months ago, we ran universal design training for a lot of our open space team, our transport, our engineers, all those physical infrastructure staff. We ran some training for those staff, and I'm looking at running some training. I don't run the training. I get another external expert on universal design. I'm going to be running some training specifically for playground design and open space design, so we can design things, as you say, Julie, for everybody, from young children to old people. And I will mention old people here. You're right to also mention old people with disabilities. 1 in 2 people over the age of 65 have a disability. So disability is a function of aging. We have to remember that as well. So as all of us get older, there's a 50% likelihood that we will acquire a disability if we haven't got one already. So let's design things universally for everybody. Let's design our houses with accessibility in mind, because there is a very, very high chance that all of us will need an accessible home.
Oh, there's so much I could respond to, but I guess I'll just say I think education around these issues is just really important, that we, talk more about disability and that it's okay to use the word, and disabled and universal design. And it's interesting, I attended a forum recently about older women, and it was great, but they really shied away. They never used the word disability or ableism when they talked about sexism and ageism. And it was just really, they were talking about disabled women, but they weren't using that language. And I guess it's that education around knowing that everything intersects and that we are allowed to use language that previously people have thought was shameful, but we now know through the social model that it's not. Yeah.
Well said, Larissa. And well done for using the word ableism several times in this video today. I think that word's also very powerful as well, and we should use that word a lot more as well, because that word ableism does speak to the inequity, does speak to the injustice. It does speak about disability rights. So I try to use ableism as much as possible. So thank you for reminding us about that powerful term as well. So use ableism. It's out there, it's real, and use it as much as you possibly can to draw attention to the injustice that we quite often see.
And and we need to name that expression, that power imbalance, because it's if we don't name it, then we can't talk about it. So ableism needs to be named. Julie, back to you.
Well, we don't really have much time left, but I'd like to ask you about stats around Merri-Bek around employment and people with disabilities, and given the fact that we don't have much time left, George.
Okay, so stats around stats and people with disabilities. We could just talk about that for a while, can't we? Because we know that there's not great reliable statistics, unfortunately, around people with disability in this country, and less so with Merri-Bek, because that's mainly because of the census question. The census question doesn't really give us some information, but some of the questions can't give us a really accurate picture about what's happening in the community with disability, because it asks questions around kind of your communication or your mobility, or do you require any assistance with daily living, without really without people kind of identifying whether they have a disability. Because a lot of people might not have any limitation with communication, or might not require any personal assistance, but they still might identify as a person with a disability. Therefore, they're not captured in the census data. So the census data really underrepresents the true figure of disability in our community. I think if we look at Merri-Bek, the census might say that we've got about maybe about 11,000 people with a disability. But in Merri-Bek, but we know that's closer to about 20% of the population, and 20% of the population is about 35,000. I was looking at some stats recently, actually. So there's probably about, there's a lot of people who aren't included in that census data. About 60% probably of people are not included in that census data. So in Moreland, we've got about 170,000 people. If we say 20% have a disability, that would be about 35,000 people in Moreland. It's a huge number, really, if you think about it in those terms. And around employment, Julie, there really isn't specific data around how many people. We know that generally that unemployment rates for people with disability is really high compared to non-disabled people. The unemployment rate of people with disability is about twice as high as that of people without a disability. So I think without looking at raw data, we don't really need that raw data, because we know that people with disability employment and education opportunities are nowhere near where they should be. People have twice as much of a harder chance to finding a job than a person who's not disabled. That's unacceptable. We need to do more that we're currently doing to give people an opportunity to find work. Employment and education is such a powerful way for people with disability to be empowered, to get out of the poverty, to participate in the community, to be included in the community. So I think for me, I really do as much as I possibly can around employment and education. We run a few employment programs. I work with Kangan TAFE, for example, to implement a work experience program in council for students with intellectual disability. We've been doing that for a couple of years now. We participate in Accessibility Day. We try to give people with other people volunteering opportunities. There's our HR team meets regularly with our disability employment service providers. We've recently entered into a project with the Commonwealth organisation called Job Access, which is an employment organisation that tries to boost your employment opportunities for people with disability in your organisation. So the whole stack of actions we've got around employment, we need to do more. I could talk more about it, but I know that we're running out of time.
Well, I'd like to thank George Paris and my wonderful co-host, Larissa McFarlane, on this very, very lively discussion. So, and I hope our viewers have received a lot of ideas and are inspired by perhaps to get involved in council and opportunities between council. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Catch us on Your Life, Your Voice YouTube channel, live every Monday fortnight or on demand.
We would like your comments and suggestions on topics that you would like us to explore. Leave your comments on YouTube comments section.
Please feel free to email us on dndyourlifeyourvoice@gmail.com or contact us via the Migrant Resource Centre Northwest Region Inc. Phone number 1300 676 044. 1300 676 044.
Diversity in Disability is a project of the Migrant Resource Centre Northwest Region Incorporated, and would like to thank the management for funding this project, especially living through the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has been difficult for people with disabilities living in isolation.